On today's show, we are digging into everything that you need to know about the 2025 NHL Draft class, highlighted by a deep dive into what sets this year's class apart from previous seasons.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this show, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. I'm your host, Sebastian High, the USHL scout over at Elite Prospects. And on today's show, we have a very exciting program in store for you as we're approaching the NHL Draft. The playoffs are beginning in many of the leagues, including all the CHL leagues. And we're just moving closer and closer to that late June draft day. And let's dig in a little bit to the macro details of this year's class. In the first segment, we're going to be digging into the various tiers of prospects through the first and second rounds and where the big drop-off occurs in talent. In the second segment, we're going to look at overall how the draft class is going to be impacted by various factors, including positional need and the limited amount of defensemen available in the first round, the various goaltending talent, which diverges from last year's lack of net-minding quality, as well as how injuries are affecting individual players' draft stocks and how NHL teams might end up going for some really big reaches in the late first round when the big first round talents are all off the board. And finally, in the last segment, we're going to be looking ahead a little bit at there still being a lot of time and room for rankings to develop and for players to raise or lower their draft stocks ahead of June's draft day, including, of course, the playoffs, which are now in full flux, and the U18 World Championship, which might play an even bigger role than usual on player rankings. But before we dig into all that on today's show, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So let's just dig into this first segment where we're going to be establishing the different tiers of prospect. And I think there are still definitely some limitations in consensus here. But overall, I think certain things are beginning to crystallize in this year's draft class. And let's start off at the top at number one, because the number one debate has been far more open this year than in most years' draft classes. Even going back to 2022, where Yuri Slafkovsky surpassed Shane Wright for that number one mantle, that was a very late season surge. We're still not really fully expecting it to happen on draft day for the Habs to forego the opportunity of picking Shane Wright to go with Slafkovsky. And this year has just been so different because going back to even October, there's been multiple names very actively in this debate, in the conversation around the first overall pick. Last year was very different, where Celebrini held that spot down all year long, even with a player like Ivan Demidov pushing him in that sense. Celebrini's lock on that number one spot never really did subside. And this year's been different. James Higgins was the number one guy coming into this season, but has no longer really held on to that spot, with two CHL players really pushing him in that race for number one. And I think either of those are more likely now to get selected first than James Higgins, and those being Matthew Schaefer, the very mobile defenseman of the Erie Otters, as well as Michael Misa, the high-producing dynamic centerman from the Saginaw Spirit. And with those three players, I think there are three very dynamic talents that could have maybe franchise level upside, depending on how their development continues. Especially with Schaefer and Misa, I think that potential exists. With Higgins, we've definitely seen those in flashes, and the dynamism, the speed, the skill in transition at high speeds is the best in this year's class. So a lot of talent here in the top end of the class. And while the 2025 draft class has often been talked about as a weaker season, I think what's often been misconstrued there is that that weakness comes a little bit more in terms of the depth of first round talent, as we'll be establishing later on in this segment, rather than the high end talent at the top. Because these three players, I think, are more than worthy candidates for a first overall NHL draft slot. And then you have another 5 or so players really pushing into the top 5 conversations as well. So I'd say you have maybe up to 7 or 8 top 5 caliber players in this year's draft, and maybe 2 first overall caliber guys in Misa and Schaefer. So you have a lot of this talent high up in the class. So I think a lot of teams that are rebuilding this season are going to get some very impactful pieces on draft day that are going to be core to their team's development moving forward. And that extends with guys like Porter Martone and Jackson Smith and Anton Frondel and Roger McQueen and Victor Eklund. They're in the top 10. There's a lot of names that have a lot of skill, have top line, top pairing potential, but are perhaps more likely to be second pairing or second line guys at the end of the day. I think Martone especially has that top line upside, but there's a bit more risk associated with him, especially in terms of his lackings of pace this season. But overall, really, really good top end of the class. I think that quality also extends into the teens. There's a lot of really interesting talents this year. A guy like Justin Carbonneau of the Blainville-Boisbriand Armada in the Cume JHL is a tremendously skilled player who can dominate entire shifts at a time, finished second in regular season scoring in the entire Q this year as a draft-eligible talent. And he might be available as late as 15th overall because there are inconsistencies in this game, in his game. And I think this is a facet that very much defines this year's draft class, going all the way from 10th overall through the end of the first round and well into the second, of players with very, very clear strengths, but also notable weaknesses that could hold them back at the next level. And I think perhaps this season there's a bit more of a limitation of super well-rounded players. Like last year, you had a guy like Michael Brandzag-Newgard go to the Detroit Red Wings at like 14th overall, 13th overall, at 15th overall, and he's a player that's just so solid in both directions. And I think that players like him that have very, very little risk are a little bit fewer and far between in this year's class, but there's more upside swings to kind of compensate for that in my eyes this season. Players like Malcolm Spence have a lot of skill, can dominate shifts as well. Benjamin Kindle comes to mind as well as a guy who could be available in that 20 to 30 range. He's the second highest producing player in this year's draft class after Michael Misa. There's a lot of skill this season, and I think a lot of teams might make out like bandits in that 15 to 25 range of the draft, of players who will fall into that range who aren't traditionally available in terms of that skill set in that range of the draft. So I think teams drafting in the early 20s and the late teens will have a lot of choice and a lot of like abundance of options at their disposal that will make the draft very interesting. And you might see teams go different routes to previous seasons, or perhaps not tending to their own traditional habits quite as much this season, just because there's going to be a whole bunch of players in the same tier available all at one time. It's going to be very interesting to keep an eye on. But let's talk about that drop off in talent a little bit, because it is a quite stark one, in my opinion. You go in the first round, maybe around 23rd, 24th overall. You're going from players with quite clear first round upside that have a decent level of likelihood of making the NHL and could also push their way up into top 6 or top 4 or starting goaltending capacity at that level, where you can balance the upside and the risk a little bit. Then you drop into players where you're either going for a bottom 6, bottom pairing, solid piece that is going to likely play for you for a decade, or you're taking a big swing on upside that is far from a guarantee, but could have really, really, really big effects on your team's success down the road. For my own neck of the woods, players like William Moore and Jack Murtagh of the US NTDP, as well as Václav Nestrasil and Ivan Ryabkin of the Muskegon Lumberjacks would come to mind as players of this profile who could be very interesting in the late first round, but could very conceivably drop into the second round onto day 2 and be good value swings, but there being different elements of risk associated with them. Nestrasil, for his part, is a very raw power forward. He's still learning how to fully use his frame. He's still a little bit wonky on his feet with just how big he is. He's 6'5", 190 pounds as a right shot winger. He's a player I think has real top six potential, but still has to really crystallize into a cohesive game. There's elements of violence and power and a lot of skill and intensity. And all that could come together into a really, really exciting power forward type of mold in the NHL on a second line capacity. And if you're getting that on day 2 of the draft, that is a fantastic value. Or he might end up being like a fourth line energy guy who has these big flashes of skill, but just can't string them together at the next level. So I think that in this range of the draft, you're getting a lot of players with different risks. Ryabkin, for his case, lack of motor. William Moore, very physically underdeveloped. You're always going to take some kind of compromise in this range of the draft where you're taking some kind of risk in some kind of sense. And that's the case every year in the draft as you go into day 2 and through the second and third rounds. You're getting very much into those swings type of talents where they're not guarantees, but you're hitting for something impactful. I think this season that drop off occurs a bit earlier, and I think it's perhaps a bit more stark than in previous years. So maybe look for this year's draft to either be a thing of teams trading down right from after that drop off to going, I don't know, trading from 26th overall to getting a couple second round picks to get a little bit more capital and to still probably be taking swings with the same tier of prospects. And you might see teams also trying to trade up ahead of that drop off in talent to get one of those clear first round guys who have both upside and some safety in their profile. So a lot of very interesting things, I think, this year in terms of how the draft is laid out. And one interesting element in that second round, when you do enter that drop off, there are so many players that fall into that range, in my view. Between 25 and 70th overall, you can make arguments for a lot of players to move up or down 15 or 20 spots. It is a very tight range of the class, so don't be surprised to see your NHL team taking some unexpected swings, even in the first round, that are names that perhaps were even being mentioned as first round talents and are more third round guys. For an NHL team, if that player is one that they really believe in and they think that the talent is on par with everyone else who's left on the board, very conceivable to take very bold swings, especially in this year's class. But we'll dig into that a little bit more in the next segment. But first, a quick message from our sponsors here at Locked On NHL Prospects. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 moneyline bet wins. That's 200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories, and even who's cutting down the nets. I've got my eye on a couple underdogs this year, and FanDuel makes it easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. The FanDuel app is so easy to use, and when I win, I get paid instantly. No waiting around. With tournament games happening almost every day, there's always something exciting to bet on. So visit FanDuel.com and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. All right, let's dig into the second segment here to keep the episode rolling. And here we're going to be looking a little bit more at how this draft class and the eventual draft order on draft day of where the players fall, how that's going to be impacted by various factors in this year's class. First and foremost, as we were talking about a bit in that previous segment, I think that gap in quality, in talent, that drop off that we're mentioning is really going to impact teams and their drafting philosophies, especially in that late first round block. I think it's going to be wide open in that range with a lot of potential movement as well, with trades going up and down, because there's a lot of potential swings to take and risks available that certain teams are going to love and others a lot less. You're going to see different teams reacting in different ways to this as well. I think certain teams like the Nashville Predators, for instance, are going to double down on just swinging hard on upside. This is an organization with a lot of prospects, a very deep pool, a lot of guys that I think are going to fill out the bottom six of the forward core and the bottom pairing longer term. But what's lacking in that prospect pool are true impactful game breakers. And with their own first round pick, they're probably going to get that in the top 5. But with the other first round pick they have, that's going to be later on in the first round. I think that you're going to see the Preds take a really big swing around that 30th overall mark on just raw upside. Whether it's a player like Cameron Schmidt who might fall to them, or maybe taking a swing on an injured guy like Carter Bear if he's available that late, I think you're going to see certain teams in need of big talents take very bold risks this season, because there's a lot of reason to, I think, in this campaign. Once that drop off occurs, and you're still going to have a couple players before the drop off be available afterwards, I think you're going to see certain teams just swing hard on those fallers. The Carolina Hurricanes as well always come to mind as a team that repeatedly just takes swings on high-end talent that probably shouldn't be available at the slot they're picking in. And I think that's going to be very evident this season. I also think that position is going to play a big role higher up in the first round, because the overall blue line quality and the depth of first round blue line quality is a bit more limited this season, especially if we're comparing it to last year's draft, where we had just so many defensemen in the mix of things in the top 15. This year, I think, is a bit different. You have the best defenseman from the past 3 draft classes in this year's class with Matthew Schaefer, but the drop off after him, I think, is quite significant. There's no player really who has entrenched himself as the number 2 guy for me just yet. Jackson Smith's been the closest, but Radi Murtka is in that conversation. So is Logan Hensler of the University of Wisconsin, and some players I think could end up pushing higher up on boards as well as we come nearer and nearer to the draft, maybe making their way into some people's top 10 rankings. Cameron Reed, Blake Fiddler, and Kayshawn Aitchison are all very clear defensive prospects before that cutoff, before the drop-off in talent. And I think that you're going to see those guys go potentially higher than many people might expect them to go, because teams will value getting a blue liner, especially for the right shots in this mix. Radi Murtka, 6'6", smooth skating right shot defenseman. He's going to be a top 10 guy, and he might even be a top 5 guy. You're going to see a team in need of a right D taking him very early. I think Jackson Smith is a player that I've had as a slam dunk top 10 guy all season long, going back to like November, but he is a left shot, and that's going to devalue him a little bit relative to Hensler and Murtka and maybe even Blake Fiddler. So it's going to be interesting to see how defensemen among themselves actually end up placing. Guy like Cameron Reed is an undersized mobile defenseman. I expect him to be the last picked of this grouping, but in terms of skill and upside, he very much belongs within it, in my view. You may very well see a team picking at 12 or 13, taking a really big swing on a guy like Kayshawn Aitchison, who has been ranked in the 20s for most of this season, because there just isn't that big physical projectable defenseman left on the board until you're getting back into the second round range, and you're getting a lot more risk with those players. Then you're getting into guys like Carter Amico and Charlie Trethewey from the NTDP. Amico's had big injuries this season. Trethewey has had a lot of inconsistency earlier on in the year, but has really found his footing here later on in the season and is retaking his draft stock and pushing back for the first round range. So a lot of different elements here with the defenseman specifically that could have big impacts on draft day in the end. And I think I had a little bit of an insight in this, because just yesterday I ran a mock draft with some excellent hockey minds. I'll link that down below. It's a 2.5 hour deep dive top 32 mock draft. And with that exercise, I really felt like with that simulation, I got a sense of where the players might fall to, which types of players might end up falling on draft day. And I think injuries are going to play a big role on that. And Carter Bear was a player that dropped massively in the mock draft, and I think will as well on draft day, because of a really ugly lacerated Achilles injury that he suffered just a couple of weeks ago from a skate blade, the type of injury that no hockey player ever wants to experience. And that's going to impact his stock. But with the way he plays, and he is just an absolute fighter, I think that energy is going to also be applied to his recovery from injury. And I think that he's going to be a guy that's going to defy the odds and come back stronger than ever from his injury. But there is risk associated there. And Amako had a knee injury that's been out with since November, but as a stabilizing big right shot defenseman, could still see his name called on day one despite that. This year's draft has so many different storylines, whether it be with these injuries, whether it be with high upside players with a bunch of risk associated with them, or that big drop off in talent that I think make this year's draft class quite unique from past seasons. Definitely a lot of elements that remind us of previous years, but overall, a very individual draft class with a lot of openness both through the top three, the number one selection, and all the way down through the first round and the second. A lot of movements going to be happening. So, whatever kind of mock drafts or rankings you're seeing, nothing that you're going to see is going to represent what actually happens on draft day. There's going to be a whole lot just up in the air all the way to late June. That makes this draft class very, very interesting to me as a scout and very fun to follow as a hockey fan in general. But that wraps things up here for the second segment. In the final one, we're going to look ahead a little bit at how the playoffs and the U18 World Championships could still impact rankings in big ways and which players might see their stocks raising or falling a little bit as a result of that. But first, a quick message from our sponsors here. Daylight savings snuck up on us once again, and if you're feeling that lost hour of sleep, 5 Hour Energy has got your back. The extra sunshine means more time for fun, but sometimes you need an extra little boost to power through. Whether you're staying up late watching the NCAA tournament, squeezing in a round of golf after work, or just trying to keep up with your busy day, 5 Hour Energy gives you that quick, refreshing pick me up whenever you need it. I've been staying up late watching all tournament long, and 5 Hour Energy helps keep me up through my day. Whether I'm at a game or traveling, 5 Hour Energy is easy to grab and keeps me feeling refreshed. Head to 5hourenergy.com to find over 15 flavors to choose from, including watermelon, blue raspberry, and peach mango. You can even build your own 12-pack or 24-pack delivered right to your door. Need one now? Grab a 5 Hour Energy shot at your local grocery or convenience store. They're absolutely everywhere. Stock up today and stay energized. All right, let's wrap up the show here in the final segment. And let's start off here by looking a little bit at how this draft class might be impacted by the playoffs and the U18 World Championships, even more so than your average draft class is. And the draft is always impacted more by these late season performances than those earlier on in the campaign. But in terms of playoff pushes, I'd be very curious to see how Saginaw's playoff push is going to impact Michael Misa's stock at number one, especially in that neck and neck fight with Matthew Schaefer, who is out with injury and hasn't been playing. I think if the Saginaw Spirit end up flying out in the first round of the OHL playoffs to the Erie Otters in a complete upset, that might have an effect on Misa's draft stock, likely unfairly so. I think that he's needing to prove himself night in, night out in order to keep neck and neck with Schaefer at number one because Schaefer's profile is just so appealing. As a high character September 5th, '07 birthday, I mean, he's almost eligible for next year's draft class by just 10 days. He's a tremendous skater, elite at both ends of the ice, highly intelligent, highly adaptable, just dominant in the OHL this season, even after coming back from mono earlier on in the year, and was the best player for Team Canada in that game at the World Junior Championships before he went down with injury. He's been proving himself at every level, and I think he's a player with real high upside, and he could very likely be the first defenseman to be drafted first overall since Owen Power in 2021. Beyond just him, you have a lot of other players that I think are really going to have a lot to fight for in their playoff fights. One of those guys is Benjamin Kindle, who's been scoring for fun in the WHL this season, the regular season, and has been part of a two-man scoring team on that team alongside of Oliver Tulka's line mate. They've been doing everything in terms of the offense this season in Calgary, but in terms of dragging his team through a playoff round or two, and they've won the first two games against the Saskatoon Blades in their series at the moment, I think Kindle could really entrench himself, not just as a top 20, but maybe even a top 15 talent in this year's class. The impact that his playmaking and overall play driving has on his team is one of the bigger ones outside the top 10 in this year's class. And the playoffs are the time to prove that and to prove that you can not just drive your team forward, but carry your team when it matters most. And so far in the playoffs, Kindle's been doing that. And I think he could certainly raise his stock quite a bit. But this is kind of the type of storyline I was mentioning in terms of there being a lot of room to move still in this draft class. Players that could still rocket up 10 slots, 15 slots, entrench themselves as first round talents while not really being in that conversation just yet. All that can still happen here late in the season, and that makes things very exciting. The U18 World Championships are going to be integral to finalizing draft boards for NHL teams, as well for prospects to make their cases as not just first round talents or second round talents, but as players who deserve to be drafted, bar none. You're going to see this resonate throughout the draft class, through the top 32, but also the top 64, and all the way to the end of the class of players fighting for their draft slots. And the U18 World Championships are always the last and likely most important time for players to prove themselves in this facet, at least in the eyes of NHL scouts. So a lot to still fight for, and a couple names I think could still fight their way up draft boards in quite notable ways. And one of these names that comes to mind for me is Milton Yestrain of Sweden. He's been playing in J20 this campaign and has looked fantastic playing internationally every single time he's put on that yellow jersey for Sweden. He's fit in wonderfully with guys like Victor Eklund and Anton Frondell, and he's outshone a player like Jacob East Wozniak at the international level perpetually this season. He's a guy that I think could really force his way into at least first round conversations more broadly with a strong U18 World Championship tournament, driving offense down the middle. Another guy that could do similar things along the same line, but with less skill and more physicality, is Cole McKinney of the U.S. National Team Development Program. He's been their number one center all season long, but at least in the especially in the last couple of months, has taken a lot of that offensive burden. He's been producing a bunch in the USHL. He's scoring goals. He's getting to the dirty areas around the net front. He's a very active player and keeping his feet moving and being an active F1 on board battles and forechecking overall. He is a player that gets to the important areas and is able to create space, gain possession, and create opportunities for his line mates with simple, straightforward plays. He's not the most complex or nuanced player in this draft class. He's a very straightforward, simplistic, but in a good way kind of player in my eyes. And I think he's going to be a first round talent in the eyes of a lot of NHL teams when the draft rolls around. And the U18 World Championships are going to be the time for him to entrench his spot in that range. Lastly, I think Kayshawn Aitchison might just entrench himself as a top 15 talent in this year's class with a very strong performance there at the U18 World Championships. But in terms of players who might fall, and this isn't just about the U18 Worlds or the playoffs, more broadly, I think in terms of profiles that end up falling, there's a couple names I wanted to bring up of very high skill players or players who have been ranked very highly throughout the years, this year, but also previous years in terms of being sought after talents as D-1, D-2 players. Ivan Ryabkin very much coming to mind in this sense. There's a lot of players that could very much fall on draft day and be available inside the second round. And I think you're going to see both some skepticism with some of these profiles, but also some excitement at being able to take swings on these guys later on in the draft class. Ryabkin especially, the motor has been a massive concern that's going to lead him to drop significantly, but he's been scoring a lot of goals in the USHL since coming over. I believe 16 goals in 21 games or so, or 22 games with the Lumberjacks since moving over to North America. There's a lot of reasons to pick this player, but the risks are large. Beyond that, you also still have guys like Cameron Schmidt from the WHL and the Vancouver Giants, who has some of the best skill in this entire draft class. CHL wide, he's probably the fastest skater, has one of the best shots. Individually, the tools and the skill is off the charts good, but he's 5'7", and even though he's violent and is a very hard worker, that is a big question mark in terms of his projection. And overall, he's also had a bit more inconsistency later on through this season than he did earlier on the campaign, where he just shot out of a cannon and was among the WHL's best offensive producers for the first couple months of the season. he slowed down a little bit, and that might see him drop quite far on draft day. But look for a team like either Minnesota Wild, maybe, or the Nashville Predators, or the Carolina Hurricanes, especially, to take the risk on him and take that big swing. A couple other players with a lot of skill that I think could fall relative to where I have them ranked on draft day would be Cameron Reed, very intelligent left shot defenseman of the Kitchener Rangers in the OHL. Carter Bear with that ugly lacerated Achilles injury. He's a player that could very much drop into that 20 range rather than being a top 10 contender like he was seeming to be prior to the injury, as well as Braden Coots, a very pacey, high motor, high end handling player out of the WHL, who's played with a very big role this season, but overall a guy that hasn't been scoring at the highest level, but hasn't been surrounded with that talent either. So look for his scoring to absolutely explode next season as a D+1 talent. But as a whole, I think that this year's draft class has all of these very interesting storylines of potential risers and fallers. A lot still left to play for through the playoffs and the U18 World Championships, and those are going to play massive roles here on how the draft is going to end up looking. And overall, a very interesting draft class in terms of how the talent is distributed and where talent might end up going due to lackings in blue line depth in the first round and the overall goaltending quality as well that there is in this year's class that there wasn't last year. I mean, Joshua Ravensbergen and Peter Andrianov, Love Herenstram, and Jack Ivankovic are just four names that I think are very good options in the top 64 among netminders. I don't think I had any netminder in my top 64 last season. So very interesting draft class here this campaign. I hope that you listening learned a little bit more about this year's class here on today's show. That wraps things up here for us today. If you're watching on YouTube, please do make sure to like, subscribe, leave me a comment down below with your thoughts on the class as a whole, who you think might be the biggest steal of the class, and who you think might be the biggest bust or the most overrated player in the 2025 draft class. I'd be very interested to hear of your opinions down below in the comments. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, please do make sure to make us your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, you can head on over to Locked On Fantasy Hockey, where Flip and Steel break down everything you need to know to build yourself a sustainable and competitive fantasy roster. But that wraps things up here for us today. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, I'm your host, Sebastian High, and I hope to catch you listening again very, very soon.